The dam went up in a single night, same as it always had. And Micah Tanner walked out to the creek at first light, expecting the usual mess of packed sticks and mud backing up his lower pasture. What he found stopped him at the fence line. The Beavers hadn't just rebuilt what he'd torn apart 2 days before. They'd rebuilt it in the exact footprint. Stick for stick, it looked like. Right down to the crooked lean where the old dam had always sagged east. He'd pulled that dam apart with his own hands 11 times that spring. Every time, within 2 or 3 nights, it came back. Not a dam. The same dam in the same place, at the same angle, as if the Beavers were working from a set of plans he couldn't see. Micah had farmed the bottomland along Coldwater Creek for 6 years by then, and beavers were nothing new to him. They dammed low spots because low spots were easy. Slow water, gentle banks, the kind of place any animal with sense would build. What wasn't easy to explain was why, after he'd cleared the site down to bare mud and hauled the debris a quarter-mile off, they came back to that same 20 feet of creek bed and nowhere else. There was slower water 40 yards upstream. There was an easier bank downstream, near the old fence corner, where the creek already narrowed on its own. The Beavers ignored both. They wanted that spot, and only that spot. And they wanted it enough to rebuild through a wet spring, a dry spell, and one stretch where Micah salted the mud on the bank just to see if it would discourage them. It didn't. By June, he'd stopped thinking of it as pest trouble and started thinking of it as something closer to stubbornness. Theirs, and increasingly, his own. He was not a superstitious man. He kept ledgers. He fixed fence before it fell down instead of after. When something didn't make sense, his instinct was to find the part of the problem he hadn't looked at yet, not to decide the problem was unknowable. So he started looking. His wife thought he was making more of it than it deserved. She'd grown up on a farm, same as he had, and she'd watched enough animals do inexplicable things over the years. A mule that wouldn't cross a perfectly sound bridge. Hens that went silent an hour before a storm nobody else could smell coming. To know that most of it resolved into something ordinary if you were patient enough to wait it out. Beavers rebuild where beavers rebuild, she told him more than once, usually while he was scraping mud off his boots at the back step later than supper. They don't need a reason a person would recognize as a reason. She wasn't unkind about it. She just didn't see the use in a grown man losing sleep over where an animal chose to pile sticks. The first thing he noticed, once he started paying real attention instead of just getting angry and grabbing a shovel, was that the Beavers weren't just building on packed mud like every other dam he'd ever seen. There was something under the streambed at that spot, something hard, flat, and regular that the animals were building directly onto. When he waded in at low water in July and felt around with his boot, he found stone. Not creek rock, tumbled round by current. Cut stone. Laid stone, flat-faced, mortared in places, forming a line he could trace with his foot for better than 15 feet before it ran under the bank and disappeared. Somebody had built something there, a long time before the Beavers ever thought to. Micah didn't say anything to anyone that week. He went back twice more at low water and traced what he could of the foundation with a length of fence wire, sketching the shape onto a scrap of paper at the kitchen table by lamplight. A rectangle, near as he could tell. The corner of a room, maybe, or a cellar. The creek ran directly over the middle of it, which told him plainly enough what had happened to whatever it had been part of. The water had moved, sometime, somehow, and taken the ground with it. He found other things too, once he knew to look. A hand-forged hinge, rusted nearly to lace, wedged between two of the foundation stones, where the current had never quite managed to work it loose. A scatter of broken crockery downstream, smoothed by 30 years of tumbling until the pattern on the shards was almost gone. None of it told him much on its own. Taken together, it told him the same thing the stone had already told him, that a house had stood there once and had not been taken down carefully, board by board, the way a family moves on from a place. It had gone all at once. He kept these findings to himself longer than he probably should have, turning them over some nights instead of sleeping, trying to decide whether he was building a real explanation or just a story he wanted to be true, because a story was more satisfying than a shrug. When he finally did lay the sketch out on the kitchen table and tell his wife what he'd felt under his boot at low water, she looked at it a long time before she said anything. She wasn't unmoved exactly. She turned the paper around to look at the rectangle from the other side, the way a person does when they're taking something seriously rather than humoring it. But she also asked him plainly what he thought he'd do with the answer once he had it. Tear the dam out an 11th time knowing there'd been a house there. Tear it out 100th time. She wasn't arguing against the stone or the shape of the foundation. She was asking whether knowing would actually change anything he did next, or whether he just wanted to know for its own sake. The way some men wanted to win an argument even after they'd stopped caring who was right. He didn't have a good answer for her that night. He only knew that not knowing had started to bother him more than the mud on his boots or the wasted mornings tearing sticks apart. And that felt like reason enough. Even if it wasn't the kind of reason that showed up on a ledger. It was that uncertainty, more than anything else, that finally sent him to the courthouse. He wanted a record, not a feeling. Records didn't care what a man wanted them to say. He tore the dam out one more time in August, more thoroughly than before, pulled every stick, broke up the mud pack, even dragged a harrow through the stream bed to disturb the footing. He wanted, if he was honest, to see if there was a limit to it. 3 nights later, the dam was back, same footprint, built directly over the buried stone line, as if the animals had simply picked up where a very old set of hands had left off. That was when he decided to stop guessing and start asking. The county courthouse kept plat records going back to before the war, filed by survey section rather than by name, which meant it took Micah the better part of a Saturday and the patient help of a young courthouse clerk before they found anything that matched his creek. But they found it. An 1858 survey plat, drawn in a careful, old-fashioned hand, showed a homestead, house, spring house, and a small mill shed, sitting directly across what the plat called Cold Water Branch, in almost precisely the spot where Micah's dam now stood. The name recorded against the parcel was Sutter. The creek on the old plat ran 20 feet to the north of where it ran now. The clerk found that detail before Micah did, tracing the surveyor's marks with one finger, and said it out loud like it surprised him even as the words left his mouth. 20 feet was not nothing. A creek didn't wander 20 feet in 30 years without a reason, and Micah, standing there in the courthouse with sawdust from the record room's old shelving on his sleeves, felt the shape of an answer starting to form before he had any of the pieces to prove it. The clerk pulled 2 more records before they left that afternoon. A tax assessment from 1857 that listed the Sutter parcel as improved with a dwelling, a spring house, and 1 mill, water-driven, and a second plat, filed in 1861, that showed no structures at all on the same ground, just the word vacant in a clerk's small, tidy hand. Nothing in between explained what had happened. Whatever the event was, it hadn't seemed worth a line in the county record. Only worth erasing a family's name from a parcel and letting the space go quiet. Micah asked the clerk on duty, an older man near retirement who'd worked the record room longer than the young clerk had been alive, whether he remembered anything about the Sutters. The man shook his head slowly and said the name meant nothing to him, but that a lot of families along the creek bottoms in those years hadn't lasted one way or another, and the county didn't keep records of why people left, only that they had. That evening, walking back to the wagon with the 2 plats folded in his coat pocket, Micah found himself doing arithmetic he hadn't meant to do. Whoever had built that foundation had been dead or gone for the better part of 30 years. Long enough that no living beaver, no living beaver's parent, and likely no living beaver's grandparent had any possible way of knowing the stone was there before it started building on it. If stories like this find you on the road home, subscribe and ride along. New stories every week, waiting at the trailhead. Back home, word got around the valley the way it always did. Not because Micah told anyone, but because the clerk mentioned it to his mother. And by the following Sunday, half the church had an opinion about the beavers on Tanner's Creek. Some of it was practical. Ansel Pruitt's boys said beavers just build wherever the current runs slowest, foundation or no foundation, and the stone had nothing to do with it. They ain't consulting a surveyor, he said, and got a laugh for it. Old man Whitfield, who'd trapped that stretch of creek for 30 years, disagreed. He said he'd pulled beaver dams apart more times than he could count in his life, in a dozen different creeks, and never once seen the animals come back to the same footprint after a full tear-out, stone or no stone. Something else was usually easier, he said, and beavers generally took the easier thing. A few of the older women at church didn't bother with theories about current or stone at all. They just got quiet when the Sutter name came up, in the particular way a room gets quiet when it's decided, without discussing it, to let someone else be the one to say the hard thing. Micah's wife noticed it too, and mentioned it to him on the ride home. Said there was a difference between people who didn't know a story and people who knew it and weren't telling. And the women at church that morning were plainly the second kind. The someone else, it turned out, was Odessa Vance. She was well past 80 by then, and she'd lived on the ridge above Coldwater Creek her whole life, long enough to remember the flood of 1858 not as a story handed down to her, but as a thing she had stood in the rain and watched happen. She told Micah the story on her porch on a Tuesday afternoon, hands folded in her lap, in the same flat, unhurried voice she might have used to describe a bad crop year. The Sutters had built their house and their little mill on the north bank, she said, in a spot that made good sense in a dry year and no sense at all in a wet one. Eli Sutter had dammed the creek himself, upstream of the house, to run a small mill wheel. Nothing grand, just enough to grind neighbors' corn for a fee. It held for 6 years. Then a spring came that filled the creek faster than anyone in the valley had seen before or since. And Eli's mill dam let go all at once, in the middle of the night, and sent a wall of water down onto the house he'd built almost directly beneath it. Odessa had been 11 years old, watching from the ridge with her father, when the water came through. She remembered the sound of it more than the sight. She remembered her father not letting her go down until morning, and what was left when they did. Nobody in the valley ever rebuilt on that ground again. Nobody wanted to. The creek, freed of Eli Sutter's dam and carrying a season's worth of debris, had cut itself a new channel through the wreckage. The same 20 feet north that the old plat and the new one no longer agreed on, and left the foundation of the house sitting quiet and half-buried under what became, over 30 years, an ordinary bend in an ordinary creek. Nobody remembered exactly where the stones were. Nobody but Odessa Vance had any particular reason to. Micah asked her carefully whether she thought the Beavers somehow knew. She was quiet a moment before she answered, and when she did, she didn't reach for anything mystical. She said she didn't know what a beaver knew or didn't. Only that flat stone under moving water made about as good a foundation as an animal was ever going to find. And animals weren't in the habit of walking past a good foundation to build somewhere worse. That was as far as she'd go. She wasn't going to tell him the Sutters were reaching up through the water to guide them. She also wasn't going to tell him it was nothing. Micah spent the rest of that fall testing the practical explanation as hard as he could, because that was the kind of man he was, and because some part of him wanted it to hold. He went after it twice more, once with a mattock and once, after a bad week, with a stick of dynamite borrowed from a road crew laying culvert 2 farms over. The blast scattered stone, mud, and sticks 30 feet in every direction and left a crater where the dam had stood. He was almost ashamed of how satisfied it made him. 4 nights later, the dam was back. Smaller, rougher, clearly rebuilt in a hurry, but in the same footprint, over the same stones, angled the same crooked way east. He tried one more thing that winter. He built a second, easier dam site himself, 40 yards upstream, packing mud and brush into a low spot that any surveyor of beaver behavior would have called ideal. Slower water, gentler bank, no buried stone to complicate the footing. He left it standing through a hard freeze, hoping the animals would simply move their operation somewhere less trouble to a man with a shovel. They visited it. He found their tracks there twice. They never built on it. The real test came the following April, when a week of hard rain sent Coldwater Creek higher than Micah had seen it since he'd bought the place. High enough that his wife stood on the porch counting the minutes between lightning and thunder, and told him flatly he had no business walking down to check on a beaver dam in weather like that. He went anyway, the next morning, once the water had dropped enough to wade the bank safely, expecting to find nothing at all. A flood that size would have taken out any ordinary dam, stone footing or not, and scattered the wreckage a quarter-mile downstream. The dam was still there, battered, lower than before, patched in 3 places with fresh-cut branches where the current had torn sections loose overnight. But standing and still sitting square over the buried foundation, as if the colony had spent the worst of the storm doing running repairs rather than let the whole structure go. Micah stood in the mud a long while that morning, just looking at it. He'd half expected the flood to settle the question for him one way or the other. Instead, it had done the opposite. Whatever was drawing the animals back to that spot was apparently strong enough to survive the same kind of water that had once destroyed everything standing on it. A flood had taken the house down once. It hadn't been able to take the dam down at all. It was Whitfield, in the end, who talked Micah into the last real test. The old trapper had followed the story all that year, mostly from the pews and the mercantile porch, offering his opinion whenever it was asked for and sometimes when it wasn't. And by that second autumn, he'd worked himself into it enough to make Micah an offer. If the stone was really what mattered, and not the animals sitting on it, then pulling the dam apart wasn't the test at all. The test was pulling the beavers themselves off the water and seeing what came next. Whitfield knew live trapping the way some men knew scripture. He'd done it for county stock ponds and for landowners who wanted beaver moved rather than killed. And he told Micah plainly it wasn't cruelty he was proposing, just information. Catch the whole colony in wire traps over the course of a week, haul them 8 miles downriver past 2 other watersheds, and let them start fresh somewhere that had never known a Sutter or a mill wheel or a flood. If the mystery lived in that one family of beavers, in some memory or habit only they carried, then the pond above the old foundation would sit empty from then on, plain water over plain stone, and that would be an answer of a kind. They trapped 6 animals that October, 1 big male and the rest smaller, and Whitfield's wagon carried them off before first light on a Tuesday so as not to make a show of it in front of the church crowd. Micah tore what remained of the dam apart himself that same week, thorough as he'd ever been. And for the first time in 3 years, he stood at the creek in November and saw nothing there but open water running low and clear over a line of stone nobody was building on. It stayed that way through the winter. Micah told himself he ought to feel satisfied. Instead, he found the empty creek harder to walk past than the rebuilt one had ever been. The following spring, a young pair of beavers, not driven off from anywhere Micah knew of, just moving through the way young beavers do when they're looking for water of their own, came up Cold Water Creek from downstream and stopped at that same 20 feet. The clerk was the one who noticed first, riding out to see how the control was holding, and found fresh-cut alders stacked against the old stone line before the mud had even settled around it. By June, there was a dam again, thinner than before but unmistakably in the old footprint, built by animals that had never so much as swum past the Tanner place before that spring. Whitfield stood at the fence line with Micah the evening they confirmed it, turning his hat over in his hands, and said the thing Micah had half expected and had been dreading all the same. It wasn't the family then. Whatever was pulling animals to that stretch of creek didn't live in memory at all, not in any beaver's memory, old colony or new. It lived in the ground itself, or the water moving over it, or some combination of the two that a man could describe but never quite reach the bottom of. He didn't offer a theory beyond that. He said a man who trapped as long as he had learned to stop expecting the last explanation to actually be the last one. By the second winter, Micah had stopped trying to stop them. Less out of surrender than something closer to respect he didn't entirely want to admit to. He found himself walking down to the creek some evenings just to watch, the way he might have watched weather coming in, not expecting an answer, just wanting to witness the thing happening. His wife started coming with him some evenings too, without saying much about why. She never did come around to thinking there was anything more to it than good stone and slow water. But she stopped teasing him for standing at the fence line after supper. And once, watching the last beaver of the evening drag a branch across the pond in the dusk light, she said quietly that it was a strange thing to feel sorry for a family you'd never met. Micah thought about Eli Sutter more than he expected to, a man he'd never met, who dammed this same water for the same plain reason Micah dammed nothing at all, to make a hard living a little less hard, and who had, in the process, without meaning to, killed his own family and buried his own house under the very water he'd tried to put to work. He thought about how a man could spend years building something meant to make life easier for the people he loved, and have it be the exact thing that ended them. He didn't know if that was a lesson or just a fact, and he decided, after a while, that it didn't have to be one or the other. That same fall, he asked Odessa Vance one more question he hadn't thought to ask the first time: where the Sutters were buried. She told him plainly enough. There'd been no time for a proper burial the night of the flood, and by the time bodies were recovered from downstream, 3 days later in one case, the ground was frozen too hard for a fresh plot. The valley had buried what it could find in the corner of the church cemetery nearest the road, in a row nobody had marked with anything more than fieldstone. because there hadn't been money or heart left over that winter for anything finer. Micah went and found the row the following Sunday, after service, while his wife waited in the wagon. 4 stones, unlettered, roughly the size a man could carry alone, set close enough together that whoever placed them had clearly known which name went with which stone, even without carving it. He stood there a long while in the cold, not praying exactly, just standing, the way he'd taken to standing at the creek. It occurred to him that he was the only living person, other than Odessa, who had ever connected that row of blank stones to the water running behind his own lower pasture. Everyone else in the valley who might have known had let the 2 things drift apart over 30 years until they were simply 2 separate facts about the county: a nameless row of stones by the road and a stubborn beaver dam on the Tanner place, with nothing left to tie them together except an old woman's memory and a survey plat in a courthouse drawer. He didn't tell the church elders what he'd learned. He wasn't sure yet what telling them would accomplish, or whether the Sutters, whoever was left to speak for them, would have wanted the story handled that way. What he did instead, that winter, was carve 4 small wooden markers of his own. Nothing official, no names, since he wasn't fully certain which stone belonged to which Sutter and didn't want to guess wrong, and set them at the head of each field stone so the row would at least look tended the next time someone walked past it. It was a small thing. He didn't do it for an audience, and he never mentioned it to Odessa or the clerk. He did it, he told his wife, because a family shouldn't have to disappear twice. Once in the flood, and again in 30 years of nobody remembering exactly where they'd landed. Stranger still was the animals doing the rebuilding now. They had no possible memory of any of it. Not the mill, not the flood, not the family. Every beaver working that dam this year had been born a decade or more after the last beaver who'd ever touched that particular stretch of stone had died. It clearly wasn't memory. Not in any sense he understood memory to work. It was something closer to inheritance, if inheritance could pass through a place instead of through blood. The shape of good stone under moving water, waiting for whoever came along next with the instinct to use it. The dam stopped rebuilding, finally, in the spring after the courthouse discovery. Not because Micah stopped tearing it out, but because he stopped tearing it out at all. He let it be. Let the creek run over Eli Sutter's old foundation stones for the first time in 30 years without a fight from either side of the argument, man or beaver. And the dam simply settled, the way dams do when nobody's disturbing them, into something permanent and unremarkable. The colony stayed 2 more seasons and then moved on, the way colonies do, upstream to easier water once the pond had done what beaver ponds do and filled in with silt behind it. The stone foundation is still under there, as far as anyone knows. Micah never dug it out. He said once to the clerk that he wasn't sure the ground would forgive him for it, and he wasn't a man given to talking that way about ground. Some in the valley still say the beavers were drawn by the flat stone and nothing more. That any creature building in moving water will take a good foundation over a poor one, and there's no mystery in an animal doing what's practical. Others, mostly the older ones, say the Sutter place never really stopped being a house, not underneath, and that something about the old walls still shapes the water, the way walls shape water, whether anyone can see them or not. A few, Ansel Pruitt's boy among them, still hold that it never meant anything at all, that a person could find a story in any patch of ground if they looked at it long enough, and the Sutters just happened to be the story this particular patch of ground had waiting. Odessa Vance, before she passed, would only ever say that she didn't know which was true, and that she'd stopped needing to. What she remembered, she said, was the sound the water had made that night in 1858. And what she'd rather remember now was that something, 30 years later, had come back to that ground and built on it instead of leaving it empty. Whether that counted as an answer, she said, was a question for someone younger than her to keep asking. The creek runs quiet there now, wide and slow behind the last dam anyone ever built on it. The water passing over stone laid by a dead man's hands and packed mud laid by animals who never knew his name.